So why are wired communications important, right? It's a great question to ask. So communications can be wired or wireless, right? And until recently, most bidirectional communications has almost been exclusively wired. It's really only in the past couple decades with technologies like mobiles and Wi-Fi that balance has started to shift towards wireless with a lot of consumer wireless technologies. And while a lot of these, especially cell phones and Wi-Fi, are immensely popular among consumers, these technologies do pose environmental threats that people need to be cognizant about. And some of these technologies are currently threatening efforts towards carbon neutrality. So a big takeaway really is that greater public accessibility of wired infrastructure can help to reduce the impact of telecommunications on climate change significantly. So just a brief overview and in comparison between these two types of technologies. I think it's important for a bit of background here. So wired technologies are used almost exclusively, I would say, if not exclusively, for a backbone of different data networks and voice networks as well as backhaul, and for many user-facing technologies still as well. So the backbone of the internet, the backbone of the telecommunications network. This is typically done with fiber these days. In the past, coaxial cable was used as well, but nowadays it's almost exclusively fiber. And then user-facing technologies, some of these can be over fiber as well. More often it's some kind of copper, whether twisted pair or coaxial. And then wireless, in contrast, is really just an auxiliary service. It was never meant to replace wired infrastructure either in the backbone of the networks or at the edge. It's really just an adjunct to provide maybe additional services or additional flexibility, but it's not really the core of what you would think of when you think of these different networks. So it's really common for these portable consumer technologies like cell phones or Wi-Fi, cordless phones, for example. These basically all take existing wired technologies and just extend it and make it somewhat portable at the cost of some other factors. So we can see here that wired technologies don't have the health or environmental risks that wireless technologies do. And technologically, wired technologies are hands down superior. They're higher bandwidth, they're lower latency, and they're higher quality. They're faster and they're more reliable and they're more secure. So technologically, wired technologies are actually superior to wireless technologies. Uh, Wireless is pretty common, and so some people have the impression that it's sort of the high tech thing now, but they're really not so great. The only real advantage of them is that they're portable, right? I mean, they're wireless, so they're not tied to a specific location, and they're more portable. But it comes at significant technological costs. It also comes at significant environmental costs. Wired technologies are more energy efficient compared to wireless technologies by a pretty significant margin. So wireless technologies are actually quite energy inefficient. So why does this matter? I think it's important to sort of contextualize this, especially today. So global communications, this was almost a decade ago now in 2012. But in 2012, it consumed almost 2,000 terawatt hours of electricity, which was 8% of global electricity production. And just last year in 2020, that number had climbed to 14%. So just the 1,815 terawatt hours, that's about 1.3 gigatons CO2. So it's a huge amount of carbon dioxide emissions. And this amount is only going to continue to increase, especially as the trend now is for more things to become wireless and more wireless things to come online. The flip side of that is that a lot of things are coming online, and everything today is networked, it seems, right? The Internet of Things is sort of a big thing that people are talking about. People have multiple devices that they're using. Um, there's sensors everywhere connected, and so there's a lot of technology coming online, and there's only going to be more and more technology, right? I don't think that trend is going to reverse itself or slow down anytime soon. So how this communication takes place, especially given that the big trend is for everything to become networked these days, makes a huge difference. The Internet of Things actually sort of builds on an old concept where you can have that type of idea, but you can do it using wired communications instead of wireless communications. So all of this being wireless is not necessarily inevitable. And so that's something to pay close attention to. So why is wireless bad for the environment? Um, it's it seems like maybe it's sort of obvious, but maybe it's actually not. So I think a big misconception or maybe oversight that people have is that a lot of these wireless devices, right, they're smaller, they consume less energy, they take less energy to charge and just use, right? If you compare, say, a mobile device to a desktop computer, one of them obviously uses more energy than the other. But you actually have to look at the entire ecosystem of technologies and infrastructure required for this technology to operate. And it's not just the end device and the energy that that specific device consumes that is relevant in this calculation. You have to consider the embodied energy that goes into these devices for manufacturing. And with mobile devices in particular, and a lot of high-tech stuff in general, most of the energy is actually not consumed while you're using it over its life cycle. It's actually even before you begin using it at all during manufacturing. The other major source of energy is uh, the access networks or the base station. So think cell towers, think Wi-Fi access points, right? This is all infrastructure that is required for wireless technologies that you don't have with wired technologies and wired networks. And this infrastructure requires huge amounts of electricity. So in the case of cell phones, it's actually a major component of the CO2 emissions and the energy consumed. And you can see on the graph on the right that radio power, the radio power amplifier, so basically RF communications, is really the biggest part of the energy consumption. So specifically, that wireless aspect of this technology is the greatest contributor to energy usage. So here are just sort of some shocking statistics about just how inefficient this technology is. So starting at the top, we can see that 3G uses 15 times more energy than Wi-Fi, and 4G uses 23 times more. We can expect that number to climb significantly with 5G technologies as well. Wireless access network technologies, so this would be the cell towers, the Wi-Fi access points, all of that infrastructure required for this technology to operate comprises 90% of wireless cloud energy usage. So when people think about the wireless cloud or the cloud in general, people often think about data centers, which is a great thing to think about. But in this case, data centers are actually not the bulk of the energy usage. It's actually just the wireless access network technologies using huge amounts of energy. So just those alone, 38.7 terawatt hours, which is the equivalent of putting 5.6 million new cars on the road. So it's a huge amount of energy. Generally speaking, wireless consumes at least 10 times more power than wired technologies for equivalent speed and traffic. That's at least 10 times more. Often it's significantly more, as we see with mobile data types of technology like 3G, 4G, 5G, etc. Those use significantly more energy than just one order of magnitude. So if you were to use a mobile phone for an hour per day, that's more than a ton of CO2 per year in emissions. And cell phone calls alone comprise more than 0.25% of global carbon emissions. So here's a comparison to sort of fixed line networks in terms of voice technologies specifically, that the consumption is 7 times more. And then these are just a couple more statistics. But you sort of get the idea here that this is not something that's insignificant or that's a small amount of energy by any means. It's something that we should really be talking about and thinking about in terms of the energy consumed and the benefits provided by these technologies as opposed to the costs that they're imposing on the environment. So a big topic right now that people have been talking about for the past couple of years is 5G technology. Maybe some of you have been hearing about that, and that's touted by the industry. It's sort of poised to be the next big generation of wireless technologies. We've come up through 4G now, and now 5G is sort of the next big generation of that. And their claim is that it's going to be revolutionary. And I think one thing that is clear is that it's going to certainly be revolutionary in terms of energy and environmental impacts. So as we sort of talked about earlier, a large part of the energy consumption comes from cell towers. About 80% of the energy consumption of cellular networks is by the antenna, the cellular antennas on these towers. And 5G would increase the electricity usage of base stations or these cell towers by 70%. So basically almost doubling what's already the most significant portion of energy consumption of these networks. So this is a big deal. And by one measure, 5G, if not stopped or checked in any way, it would increase CO2 emissions by 250 megatons, or 1/4 of a gigaton. And just to put that into perspective, that's 7 times the entire CO2 emissions of the country of Sweden. So this is not just communications or just wireless communications. This is specifically the increase just from 5G. So this is a big deal. It's 1/4 of all emissions generated by the entire aviation industry worldwide. And I think everybody has a pretty good sense of how destructive aviation is to the environment. 5G is almost just as big of a deal in terms of the amount of energy that would be consumed. So here is one chart showing some of the increase in power requirements that would come along with 5G. And we can see that as we go generation to generation, 2G to 3G to 4G and now 5G, you have a continuous increase in the energy requirements of the cell sites. Here's just another graph or two showing sort of the same phenomenon of increase in energy requirements. So I like how these quotes that I've excerpted here summarize some of the main problems with 5G with regards to climate change. So here's one saying that basically if we're going to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement and mitigate the effects of climate change, then this is an industry that we should be paying close attention to. Sort of the whole information and communication technology area, communications technology, that whole sector, and the carbon footprint of that sector relevant to other economic sectors, meaning that there's nothing inevitable about going green with going electronic or going digital, or especially with going wireless. And so it's important to pay attention to that. And then specifically on the subject of 5G, 5G would most likely compromise our targets for carbon neutrality and reduced emissions. So the good news is that there are more sustainable options. There is an alternative to all of this that we can use to reduce the impact of the sector and reduce the carbon footprint of communications technologies. So for networking, uh, with wired connections, you basically have the connection to the internet and then your local area connection. So DSL or cable or fiber broadband, uh, that's the most efficient method for internet access specifically. And then on the local area network side, Ethernet. So that's a technology that's been around for several decades, originally with coaxial cable, but nowadays it's all twisted pair. So you can have unshielded or shielded twisted pair cable. Cat5, Cat5e is probably the most common. But basically, these are sort of the backbone of most local area networks already in larger environments where you have wireless access points individually placed throughout the building. Those are just connected back to the switch using Ethernet cables. So this isn't anything new, it's just taking what's already there and extending it directly to the endpoint. So a lot of desktops are already connected using Ethernet cables. Most desktops don't have wireless capability since they don't move around, so why would you need that anyway? It's sort of unnecessary. But what you can do is take your portable devices like your laptop and then hardwire that using an Ethernet cable. Some computers, especially some laptops, I should say, most desktops will have Ethernet ports still. I mean, that's a very standard thing. But laptops, in sort of the name of efficiency and modernizing and slimming down, a lot of them lack a lot of the standard peripheral ports that they used to. Not just Ethernet, but other things like USB ports, VGA, uh, CD drive, whatever, right? But you can get a USB to Ethernet adapter fairly cheap, and that will allow you to hardwire to the network, regardless of whether your computer has an Ethernet port or not. So it's definitely a great option. You can find Ethernet ports all around. They're sort of hidden if you're not looking for them, but they're available in a lot of places. So if you're on a college campus, a lot of dorms have Ethernet ports. At home, you can hardwire your house with Ethernet if it's not already, or if you're in the same room as your switch, you can just plug right in there directly. So there's lots of options there. Public accessibility is still an area where it could be improved. If you go to Starbucks, it's quite unlikely that you're going to find Ethernet ports at each booth. But maybe then it's time to reevaluate what you're trying to do there anyway. So on the telecommunications side, landline telephones by far remain the most efficient means of voice communications. So specifically comparing landlines to cell phones, it's there's not even any competition. It's significantly more efficient, whether you're looking at analog or digital systems. Um, it's just significantly more efficient. And if you think about it, you can have a large number of these phone lines connected to one central office, and then it's quite efficient in that you can power it all from there. So with a standard phone, it's powered directly from the phone line, and you don't need any mains electricity at the actual site to power the phone because it gets everything it needs from the phone line, and that's all coming from one central office, as opposed to individually powering a bunch of devices and then adding the cellular networks in scattered all across the city. It's just a huge energy footprint compared to a system that works much better with common batteries, just much more efficient. So public communications is a related topic that's especially important here. specific to telecommunications, I think, in a way, because it's sort of this basic public service that's quite important. You don't necessarily need to be online wherever you go, but public communications in the form of telephony is important, and it's become at this point almost a public utility in the same way that public transportation is. Um, Amtrak doesn't make a profit. I think it's actually making a quite substantial loss, but it's kept around in order to provide this basic public utility service. And in the same way, payphones and other public phones like courtesy phones serve an important purpose in providing that public communications option and maintaining accessibility, but also allowing for high quality communications on the go, while also reducing your carbon footprint. So that's also something to keep in mind. In the past, these have been a profit center for many providers. That's become less and less the case with the proliferation of cellular technologies, but it's still an important public communications medium to keep around. So shifting gears a little bit, let's think about why it matters and maybe why it's especially pertinent right now. We're in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, and what does that mean? It means that we have a lot of telecommuting and teleconferencing right now, more so than ever before. And something that some people have honed in on is that with all of this telecommuting and teleconferencing, carbon footprints have decreased because people aren't moving around as much, people aren't flying around on airplanes as much, and that's definitely had a positive impact. But there's actually a little bit more to that. People sort of have the impression that anytime you're doing something online versus moving around, then that must be necessarily more efficient, and that's actually not necessarily the case, right? There's no guarantee of that always being true. So this is a graph from one study that sort of illustrates this concept where with teleconferencing or video conferencing in this case, you have this flat level of emissions that's essentially constant regardless of where participants are distributed. That's not necessarily entirely true, but you can sort of use that as an optimization here. And then with in-person travel, that obviously becomes more energy intensive as the distances between participants increases and you have more participants and you use more energy intensive means of transportation like flying or using private automobiles. So what did they talk about here? So there's this idea that you sort of have this trade-off where if you're commuting, you get to the point where pretty easily that's more energy intensive than telecommuting. But at the lower extremes, you sort of cross into the other direction where maybe that's not the case, right? So I think the first example is a good illustration of what people typically think about, right? Flying is very energy intensive, and flying from London to New York, that's equivalent to 55,000 hours of Zoom teleconferencing, which to put that into perspective is about 6.5 years. So there's really no question here, no competition at all. Teleconferencing is significantly more environmentally friendly than flying halfway across the world, no question there. But what if you're not flying halfway across the world? What if you're just driving 10 kilometers in, say, electric vehicles? Now it's significantly less of an impact, and this is equivalent to about 21 hours of Zoom teleconferencing. And if you're taking the underground to work, this was a study conducted in the UK, then that's about 12 and a half hours of Zoom. So what these authors are saying here is basically you get to the point where they're so close together that this uncertainty, basically these other variables about like, is your camera on? How efficient is the data center? Maybe are you using wired or wireless for your teleconferencing, right? Those other variables that are negligible at the large scale of flying from London to New York, suddenly those are very pertinent because those could very well be the difference in whether or not this is actually more environmentally friendly than physically commuting somewhere. So this is something that's important to think about for companies and people who are looking to make their teleconferencing or telecommuting even more environmentally friendly and make sure that it is really the green option, is taking additional steps to make sure that that's the case, like making sure that everyone is using wired technologies, like not using Wi-Fi at home, certainly not using mobile data, which would be extremely bad, but trying to be as efficient as possible there. So what are some things that are going on right now or that have transpired more recently? So with broadband, particularly in the area of 5G, right, the FCC, this was a year or two ago, but they set aside $9 billion for 5G specifically. And this was out of $20 billion for rural broadband in total, which is about half of all rural broadband funds going towards 5G technology, which is pretty tremendous. And that means that about half of these funds are going towards a technology that isn't going to solve the digital divide really in any meaningful way and is going to be extremely costly for the environment, extremely energy intensive, while not really providing the benefits that these companies claim that the technology will. Another thing that's going on is SpaceX wants to launch satellites to essentially provide wireless internet service from low Earth orbit. And they've already launched 1,000 of these, and one can imagine that there's a pretty significant environmental impact from launching all these satellites and maintaining all these satellites and the energy consumption there. These were just some quick calculations that I did to figure out what the energy impact of the launches alone would be, and it works out to about 0.1 megaton just for the launches alone, which is still a pretty significant amount of energy for something that could easily be done with many better wired alternatives instead of using this approach. So it's very important to recognize that these things are going on right now. And whenever possible, instead of looking at things like these, we should be looking towards high-speed wired broadband options instead, which are more durable, faster, higher bandwidth, and better for rural areas and really all areas in the long run. And something that I was reading about a couple weeks ago, actually, that somebody else had sent out was SpaceX is looking to set up a launch site in Indonesia, and in the process of doing so, they'd be displacing essentially the whole indigenous population there. So if we're looking at issues of sort of environmental justice or social equity, um, this is an area where it's also hugely devastating on those fronts. And these issues all sort of go hand in hand in one way or another. Here's something that I was reading about in the local newspaper a couple weeks ago, which I thought was particularly surprising, actually. So the headline is Technology Legislation Offer Hope for Rural Internet Access, which always sounds good on the surface, of course. Anytime you talk about getting rural internet access, you can pretty much expect widespread public support, right? That's usually a topic that people can agree on. But the devil is always in the details, right? So if you look through this, you get to a point where it basically says that it takes so much energy to power these drones. What they're going to do is basically have drones be up in the air all the time to provide internet access with cellular technology. But it takes so much energy to do this that these are tethered to a power cord, tethered to a power source on the ground. And doing some more research on this, it seems that what they're actually tethered to is a generator. So you basically have all these drones hanging around in the sky, and they're all plugged into a generator that's continuously running to power these things. So you can imagine that this is going to be absolutely devastating for the environment. Instead of putting in fiber or putting in cable or maybe DSL, right? You have all these other great wired options, but instead they're going ahead and basically choosing the most environmentally destructive approach possible. And of course, on exactly the topic that you don't want this kind of widespread support, of course, you have bipartisan support to add insult to injury in a highly political age where basically nothing ever gets done. You have bipartisan support for such a terrible project. So that's sort of the irony here. Local zoning control is absolutely a huge issue as well in terms of stopping these technologies. We know that the FCC has been essentially negligent to do almost anything for many years now. And so these are two California bills that are actually going around right now. So if you're in California, definitely pay close attention to these. But this is just one example of many bills that are circulating around the country that would further remove protections and barriers to 5G technology that would allow the technology to go ahead even more unchecked. So these are, in many cases, almost like a last line of defense, and it's very important that these be preserved so that different communities can do their own due diligence with regard to these technologies. Smart meters are another area. It's I included this because it is somewhat related to the topic of communications. Basically, what smart meters are there these digital and wireless utility meters that have really been pushed heavily by the utility industry, particularly the electric industry in the past 10 or so years uh, to phase out the old analog electromechanical meters that have been common for a very long time. And what's different about these is that it's actually an actual electronic device. So it has a switched mode power supply in it, and actually it has to do work in order to function. And the greenwashing that the industry has done is portray this as sort of this necessary upgrade to the smart grid. That's what they say. These meters are a necessary upgrade to the grid, which is complete baloney, of course. It's complete industry greenwashing. These meters don't provide any benefits to the environment. In fact, they're incredibly environmentally destructive, as just these calculations here can show. But they don't provide any tangible consumer benefits really, apart from uh, since they can read the meter remotely, they might know when an outage occurs a little bit faster, which, okay, that might be good. But that type of thing comes at a significant cost, and it's really not just about that. There's a whole lot more to these meters and utilities like this, because then they can then monitor your electricity usage, and then they have that data which they can then monetize. And there's many issues with these meters, but specifically focusing on energy consumption, an electromechanical meter consumes basically no power. It doesn't really cost anything to run, as opposed to the smart meters, which are active devices. And so consuming 2.37 kilowatt hours a day, that is up to 865 kilowatt hours per year. And on the right, I've included a chart from William Bathgate, who testified to the Michigan Public Utilities Commission a couple years ago when they were doing hearings on, I think it was House Bill 4221, if I remember correctly, which would preserve an analog opt-out at no cost. But basically, you can see here that these meters actually require substantial amounts of money to operate, and it's basically just a transfer of money from consumers to the utilities for no benefit to the consumer at all. And if we're looking at carbon emissions, it's actually a huge amount of carbon emissions, totaling to about 7.8 billion tons of CO2 consumed or emitted per year. So no evidence that this program saves energy. It just drains the bank accounts of consumers and contributes to global warming. So this is sort of a no-brainer area as well. If you have a smart meter on your home, you can opt out, and you should be able to opt out at no cost really, and just demand to have an analog meter instead. Active dismantling, this is another thing that's been going on for quite some time actually, going back, not decades, but going back at least several years now. Many incumbent providers have been looking to discontinue their regulated provider of last resort obligations, and they've been petitioning the FCC for this for many years now, and in most cases, if not all cases, those petitions are granted. So what they're looking to do is discontinue their obligation for providing these regulated basic wireline voice services, like a traditional POTS landline. And sort of exacerbating that is just the widespread negligence by these companies like AT&T and Verizon to basically stifle and let the technology fall into disrepair. Verizon has been particularly pronounced about this. There was a memo a couple years ago that basically said if Verizon techs repaired copper phone lines, they would be fired. So basically, if you do your job, we're going to fire you. That was basically the company's stance. And apart from being completely ridiculous, it just feeds right into their agenda of trying to force people over from this high quality, reliable, and environmentally friendly infrastructure onto lower cost, for them, more profitable wireless alternatives, which aren't regulated and which right now are sort of the big cash cow for them. And there's this group out there called the Irregulators that has been focusing on some of these issues of not only negligence, but also these illegal cross subsidies, where on paper these wire networks sort of are made to appear that they're not profitable, but what utilities have just been doing is cooking the books and transferring money from the wired portions of their business to the wireless portions of their business. And actually, if you were to look at the true cost of operation, then the wireless businesses would not actually be as profitable as these companies make it out to seem. And that's one of the things that regulators has been doing. I don't agree with all of their stances on technology. They're sort of one of these groups that promotes the idea that we need fiber everywhere for everything, to completely replace, or basically they call it an upgrade to the network to move copper over to fiber, which is really sort of this big misconception about the technology, that fiber is an upgrade in all respects to copper, and it's actually important to keep the copper around for voice networks. But specifically focusing on wireless and these cross subsidies, they've done a pretty good job at exposing some of that fraud and what these companies are trying to do. So Biden's broadband plan, that's something that people have been talking about with the infrastructure package that he's proposed recently. Basically, this is right from his plan from the White House. And it basically says that he prioritizes building future-proof broadband infrastructure in underserved areas to get 100% broadband coverage, which is definitely a worthy goal. The question is sort of, again, the devil is in the details here. what does he mean by future-proof? That's something that a lot of people are trying to figure about. And the general consensus is that to at least a good extent, that certainly means fiber technologies. So getting fiber into a lot of these areas that really don't have any infrastructure for that at the moment. The other question, though, is does this idea include 5G technologies, and if so, to what extent? So that's really the big question here, the $1 million question, or I guess the $1 billion question. Is Biden going to go big and insist on fiber and fiber only, or is he going to cave into what the wireless industry would like and basically allow for inferior 5G connectivity to sort of be used instead of fiber? And it's really important that we push for fiber only, or at least wired options only, to make sure that these areas get the high quality, high bandwidth wired internet access that they really need. So to summarize a lot of these ideas, the good news about this issue is that, right, we're not waiting for some new technology to come around and solve this issue. The solutions all already exist. They've already existed. In fact, the solutions have existed for longer than the problems have existed, right? The solutions were around way before these problems started creeping in and making problems. So, Ethernet, landlines, right? These are all options that have been around for a very long time. So, uh, if we sort of moved away from them, there's no reason that we can't start moving back as a society to these technologies. They're faster, they're more reliable, and they're much more energy efficient. So they provide massive consumer benefits and user benefits. It's not just about the environment, right? The environment is important and should certainly be a factor in this consideration. But it's not like a sacrifice that you're making for the environment. That's sometimes how it's portrayed. Oh, this is a sacrifice that we need to make for the environment, and it's not really a sacrifice. And I would caution against framing it that way, because it actually provides massive benefits to the user. The only caveat is of course that it's not as portable of technology being wired. But that's something to think about. So even if we're looking at a 50% reduction in wireless, and this was just on one of the statistics, that could be a 45% reduction in energy consumption by 2050, which would be 20 million tons of CO2 saved. And this is a very conservative statistic that I've computed here. There's many areas where we could improve on this area and move away from wireless to wired options that would benefit the planet. It's not just about raw electricity usage either. If you look at the embodied energy of different devices and the life cycle of different technologies, the wired options are definitely more durable, more reliable, and last longer, and often have lower manufacturing costs and environmental impacts. So it's basically a win on all of these fronts. Okay, and these are some of the references that were used in compiling this presentation. And now we're going to move on to the Q&A aspect to focus on some questions that have been submitted by the public with regards to some of these technologies. So uh, does 5G mean that there will be less? I guess, does 5G mean that there will be fewer cell towers? And I guess I want to be careful here. I think that the answer is yes and no, and that if by this you mean an actual cell tower, right? What we typically and traditionally have thought of as cell towers, these big, massive monopoles or towers that are often 100 or hundreds of feet high. 5G is going to require more cell antennas closer to the end user, right? Because the technology doesn't penetrate as far. There's some discussion about maybe it does go further than some people think right now, or than some of the utilities are claiming. But generally speaking, it's going to be in a massive increase in cell sites. But not all of these are going to mean towers necessarily. In fact, a big part of this is, for example, antenna that are right outside on your street, maybe, perhaps on a light pole or right outside your bedroom window, right? It's not going to be a cell tower, but it is going to be a 5G antenna. So does it mean that there will be fewer cell towers? Um, Whether we'll actually see a reduction in cell towers due to 5G, that seems somewhat doubtable. But what it will mean for sure is that there's going to be an increase in the number of cell sites that aren't necessarily what we've traditionally thought of as cell towers. So it's so yes and no in that respect. I'm curious about if it is realistic to convert back to the wired stage. I would still not give up on my phone, and I think the world will likely develop toward wireless. Is there any other way to mitigate this issue? And I guess this is probably indicative of probably a large portion of the public, right? So many people have become dependent or even addicted on a lot of these wireless technologies, right? How do you think about moving away from them in a way that doesn't feel like the sacrifice, right? Like uh, this question is framed to make it seem like it's a sacrifice, right? That we're having to revert to something that's older or less benefits to the consumer. And again, I don't think I would frame it that way. You don't have to give up your phone, right? You can have actually a better phone that works better and sounds better, but maybe it's not the same experience that you're used to, right? Um, but if we're talking more literally about some of these technologies, right? Like say there are people who don't want to give up their mobile devices, right? You can still hardwire those, and there are options to do so. It's a little bit more difficult than just plugging a USB to Ethernet adapter into your computer because mobile devices don't have USB ports. But there is still ways to do that. Usually it requires two or more adapters. So it starts to get a little bit clunky. But if that's something that you're interested in doing, that's definitely an option. And that way, at least when you're at home, you're sitting on a desk, you can plug that adapter in, and then you can not use any wireless, but you can still access the internet, access other things on your network without using wireless. So even if we're not going to move fully away from these technologies, there are still ways to reduce the impact of that wireless transmission. Since there is such a large push by major telecommunications companies to 5G wireless, how is more awareness being raised about its high energy consumption? It seems like many people are welcoming 5G and wireless that then continuing to use wired communications. And yeah, I guess this is a fair point, right? A lot of consumers um, like this technology. You know, there's something about 5G, which maybe at least from a marketing or consumer perspective, just makes it sexier than say a landline phone or an Ethernet cable, right? I mean, there's nothing attractive about things that do their job, that work, are durable, and last for a long time, right? That's kind of old school now. People want things that are flashy and trendy and don't last very long, right? So I guess I would say maybe it's time to start reevaluating uh, what you're looking for in technologies, or maybe what you're actually trying to get out of them. Is it just to keep up with everything with the next best thing, or do you have specific goals that you're trying to accomplish, right? So if more people become aware of this, then I think actually it would start to go the other way pretty quickly. With many people are already opposed to 5G, and that could only continue to grow. So with greater awareness, we can definitely move people in the other direction. It's true that there is this large push for 5G wireless, right? That the companies are doing, and whether you think it's about national competition like with China or between the different carriers. At the end of the day, it's really just about their bottom line. These companies don't care what's good for the planet, right? So regardless of what they're doing, it's always good to take a critical look at these technologies and think about what the impacts exactly are. What can be done to mitigate the effects of wireless is increasing negative environmental impact. This sort of almost reads to me like, what can be done to mitigate the effects of tobacco on the human health? I mean, it's such a funny question actually that it's framed that way. Um, but I guess I would say that there's a lot that can be done to move away from this technology, which would be the mitigation that we really need at this point. The technology is not really all that people think it's cooked up to be, and there are other options that many people are just simply unaware of that they could be using, right? Right now, in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, there's almost no need for any of this wireless technology, right? People are working from home, often sitting at a desk all day, right? You can just hardwire all of your stuff. You don't need a cell phone, right? I mean, you're at home and you can just, you have the landline right there. So a lot of this isn't even justified right now, especially in the pandemic. So um, I think now is maybe a good time, or as good a time as any, to start thinking about what technologies do I really need right now, and is there a better way to do what I'm currently doing? And that would be a great point or a great area to start to think about that and to reevaluate and to maybe begin a transition away from these technologies. And as things go back to normal, I guess, as they say, um, then it will be more natural and easier to continue that transition. How exactly do smart meters work again? Is this similar to the net metering system that we discussed for solar energy? And okay, yeah. So I guess so. Smart meters are basically the overarching goal with smart meters is to have there's two flavors. There's what's called AMR and AMI, the automated meter reading and the automated meter infrastructure. And basically, the end goal is with AMI to be able to have two-way wireless communications between every utility meter and the utility. So, for example, they can remotely shut off your electricity or get readings, right? A lot of these smart meters are transmitting every 10, 15 seconds. Utilities will outright lie about how often they transmit. And so not only are there health consequences to be concerned about from these transmissions, especially if you have a bank of 40 meters on an apartment building, but if you have it transmitting every 10 to 15 seconds, now that's thousands of times per day. And just think about what that means for all of these signals to be from every utility meter generated and relayed through mesh networks to the utility, just to get your time of use, energy usage, and know what kinds of appliances you're using. Again, no consumer benefits, right? It's all about more profit for the utility, but it comes at a massive environmental cost. And that's really the crux of smart meters. So utilities will claim that these meters are necessary for net metering. If you want to go solar, they'll say you need a smart meter so that we can do net metering. And that's not really true. With the analog meter, you can do net metering too. The meter just runs backwards in the reverse direction, basically. But the smart meter, again, it's not about what's good for you, right? It's about what's good for the utility. And smart meters are good for the utility, and that is their agenda. So they will push hard, and they have pushed hard for smart meters. So you can do net metering without smart meters, and that would definitely be the best option. If you were looking to have solar on your house, you don't need a smart meter, right? If you want to connect it to the grid and still be connected with the grid, you can do that with an analog meter. Whether your utility will like that is a different question, but whether or not it's possible, it definitely is. How do we weigh the trade-offs between wired communication being more energy efficient, but wireless communication being the trend thanks to lower costs. Yeah, I'd be careful here with this one. I wouldn't necessarily say it's about lowered costs. The only sense where that might be true is maybe for the utilities, right? It's potentially more profitable for them because, um, again, it's not a super high quality thing that they're providing, right? But it sells, and they know that. So lower costs for them potentially with deploying this infrastructure. I think after Hurricane Sandy, Verizon didn't want to replace a lot of the wired infrastructure in impacted areas of New York City or New Jersey. I forget where was it exactly. But after an incredible public pressure, they relented and I think put in fiber or something. But they're definitely looking to do that, right? As far as the consumer perspective goes, I can't see how it would be lower cost at all. In fact, if you compare the life cycle of owning, say, a cell phone to a landline phone, right? I mean, I have telephones that are more than half a century old, in perfect working order, and they'll probably continue to work just fine for another half century or more, right? They just a lot of these wired options are just more durable, simpler options that work very well, right? And mobile devices are not built to be reliable, right? They're built to be portable, and so that comes at an incredible cost, literally and environmentally, right? So if you're buying these $600 devices that you have to replace every couple of years, um, add that to the service charges for using the service, and it's exponentially, incredibly more expensive. If you look at the life cycle and costs of ownership and operation than some of these wired options. So these wired options are actually better for the consumer's pocketbook. So lower costs go with the wired option. Clearly, 5G is a much anticipated technology, and clearly it is very power consuming. However, is it likely that its speed and capabilities will help us save energy in other areas? And really, I think you've this question hits on sort of the big thing that the wireless companies are promoting, is that that's where this technology will help us, right? With being able to have the Internet of Things and automated machinery and all of this infrastructure that will use 5G to become more efficient. But you don't need 5G to do that, right? um, there's no inherent reason, right, why this big piece of machinery needs 5G in order to send sensor data to some sort of processing unit, right? It could just, if it's already sitting in one place, right, it could be wired, right? Um, there's no justification for 5G here, right? I mean, that's almost a completely arbitrary argument, actually, right? It's not that 5G is going to help us save energy. It's that maybe that communication will happen, right? There's nothing that dictates 5G specifically. Some of the other arguments or technologies that might be more pertinent, right? If we're looking at like small Internet of Things devices or autonomous things, right? But even in those areas, right, like with vehicle to vehicle communications, um, does it need to be 5G, right? I mean, I guess we could be even that's a whole nother can of worms that we could talk about, but does it need to be 5G or does it need to be something that's more peer-to-peer, like Bluetooth, for example? So utilities have talked about it, or sorry, wireless providers have talked about it, but the justification just really isn't there. And if we're actually looking at the net impacts overall, Miguel Coma, I believe, has done some good research and work in this area, trying to figure out what the actual impacts are. And what he concluded was that the benefits that the providers claim that this will provide in terms of energy savings pales in comparison to the actual amount of energy consumption increased from having these technologies around. So uh, the costs and harms to the environment are significantly greater than any marginal benefits that the technology could provide. So essentially the answer to this question is no. It's not likely that its capabilities will help us save energy in other areas, and you don't need 5G for speed either, in fact. If you're trying to get speed, again, 5G is being promoted for super fast wireless connectivity, but it's not super fast connectivity. Super fast connectivity you can get even better with some of these wired options like fiber optics or even coaxial cable. So there's nowhere where 5G is inherently the solution for this, and in fact, it's very much the problem. The benefits of going back to wired technology seems like a no-brainer. I agree. Can you talk more about the feasibility of shifting the globe country back to the wired technologies? Yeah, this is a great question, and I think that as I've said a couple times, there's nothing inevitable about a lot of these wired technologies, right? Other than the momentum that they've built up among these providers and consumers and widespread adoption, right? But things can change, right? Smoking used to be commonplace. It was very common, even in hospitals, right? But we don't see that anymore today because people learned and behavior changed. So it's not inevitable that the way things are today is always how they are going to be. So I think it's definitely feasible that we can shift back to the wired technologies, and ultimately that's most likely going to become necessary. It's not really a question of if, it's more a question of when or how quickly. Um, the past couple of decades, especially, we've sort of been, as a society, we've been dabbling and playing around with these wireless technologies. But basically, what we've seen is that this is just not a sustainable approach. It's not going to lead to a sustainable future, and especially with climate change being a big issue these days, it's imperative that we take all of the available solutions and really take a hard look at them and think about that. And this is an area where it's almost a no-brainer. I agree with that. It's almost a no-brainer to just go to these technologically superior solutions that will have lower environmental impacts. And so, you can start small, right, in your own homes, right? You can get rid of all of your wireless technology pretty easily at home and have wired options there, right? You can maybe start by not using cell phones at home or putting them in airplane mode or hardwiring them. And that will cut out that wireless aspect, right? Hardwire all of your computers, right? Use a corded landline phone, right? That's a great way to get started. And at work, right, or college campuses, whatever, right, you can just keep an Ethernet cable with you and hardwire wherever you can. And if that's not an option, then maybe push for the building administrators to make that an option, to have those public Ethernet ports available. In the same way that outlets are provided for charging your laptop, right? Ethernet ports should be available for that high-speed wired uh, network connectivity. So it's an area where some steps are bigger than others, but everyone can get started with it pretty easily. Um, so I think it was Gandhi who said, "Be the change you wish to see in the world," and this is a great area where you can really take steps in your own life. There isn't a high cost to getting started with this at all. There are very easy and simple ways you can start to improve your own lifestyle, make it more environmentally friendly, while getting some benefits out of that. If negligence of existing infrastructure is such a huge problem, especially in regard to AT&T and Verizon, why has our government not done much to ensure that these phone providers and companies are, I think, not dismantling obsolete infrastructure that are literally rotting? Why is there no political willpower to deal with this problem? Okay, so I think a couple of things here. I think there's sort of this misconception here. What these utilities are saying is that this infrastructure is obsolete, and that's really the excuse that they're peddling in order to justify their dismantling of it. But that's basically the myth that they're trying to sell. And actually, these infrastructures are not obsolete. In fact, they're incredibly important, and a lot of pretty much the modern digital world depends on this infrastructure. It's only obsolete because it isn't being maintained, and so the key thing is that it needs to be maintained and needs to be looked after. And that's where companies like AT&T and T and Verizon have really failed miserably, and they've really been doing a miserable job there. And in the past even half year, AT&T with their uh, announcements to discontinue ADSL or new ADSL orders, I should say, as well as all existing dial-up access. That really shows that they're not interested in bridging the digital divide, and they're not interested. It's sort of a subtle thing that they're trying to discontinue all of the services that rely on their copper phone lines. So it's not that it's obsolete, it's just that it's not being maintained, and that's really the key problem here. There's a report called FCC Captured Agency out of Harvard University. I think that does a pretty good job showing why the government has basically not done anything. It's because the government is sort of also part of the problem here. As far as political willpower, um, from time to time you do find that, but again, largely politics today are pretty broken. So I think if we're trying to look to politicians for the solutions to all of these problems, then we might be looking for a very long time. How will emissions increase after companies decide to return to their offices and resume work travel? I thought of this after a discussion of Zoom's emissions versus those from traveling on a commercial jet. Yeah, this is a good question. I think this is important to think about. Emissions are probably going to increase in terms of physical commuting, right? I think that's the thing that's relatively low right now. And specifically in the area of technology, I think that will be more interesting to watch and see. Um, right now is definitely a time where wired options are more feasible than ever. Whether that's really going to be catching on more before things sort of go back to how they were, I'm not sure. But I think that physical travel is definitely a way that it will increase. And I think it's not really about um, physical travel versus telecommuting, right? It's not necessarily competition. It's about whatever you're trying to do, choosing the approach that makes that a more sustainable option, right? So like walking or biking instead of driving a car, or taking the train instead of taking a plane, or using a wired option to telecommute instead of using Wi-Fi at home or mobile data, for instance, right? There are options that, regardless of what you're trying to do, you can take to make that a more sustainable option. So I think that would be a good focus, a good focus really, um, is reducing those emissions as much as possible. Um, and if it's sort of a no-brainer and it's practical and one's significantly more efficient than the other, then choosing that one. But regardless, always looking to reduce the impact of whatever activity that you're engaging in is important to keep in mind. So whether it's physically commuting or telecommuting, businesses would definitely do well to take a close look at that and think about how they can make that more sustainable, how they can reduce the impact of that activity. How do activists go about convincing governments to acknowledge and implement legislation regarding the harmful effects of wireless energy? Is this advocacy done by nonprofits, private organizations, businesses, or politicians? Are there any solutions to this issue that you think the public will accept? Many people, including myself, are very dependent on wireless technology. Yeah, and I think this is something that's good to talk about because, right, a lot of people, especially young people, are very dependent on wireless technology. But there's not necessarily anything inevitable right about that. That could change, right? 25 years ago, teenagers were all tied up on their Princess and Trimline phones, right? So things change over time, and the technology of today that people are dependent on is not necessarily indicative of what people are going to be dependent on tomorrow. So this is something that activists are currently focusing on in the field. There are a lot of people doing very good work right now, trying to wake up government officials and different organizations to acknowledge a lot of these impacts, not necessarily just from an energy perspective, but also from a health and safety perspective, to implement legislation regarding a lot of the harmful effects of wireless technologies. And some states in the US have done that. Developed countries like the US, Canada, UK, and Australia are typically among the last or least likely to do things like that. So it's always sort of an uphill struggle. But there's definitely good work that's been done in the past couple of years that will continue to get done, hopefully. So always good to make more people aware of this issue and to get more people involved with this whole movement. Um, it's definitely a coalition between different nonprofits. Um, I don't know if I would say private organizations or businesses so much, or politicians. There are some politicians who have, for instance, talked about maybe taking a look at placing a moratorium on 5G technologies, more for health reasons than for energy reasons. But all of that is definitely a good step in the right direction. So as far as solutions that the public will accept, again, I think that's a matter where we're sort of consumer education and changing the framing of this whole idea from uh, let's take this as an opportunity to maybe improve how we use technology and how it impacts our lives, right? And actually get more out of it rather than just portraying it as a sacrifice, which I think sort of does a disservice to this, and that it really doesn't have to be a sacrifice, right? It can be a real opportunity to really improve that relationship with the technology and improve what you get out of it. So even though today it might seem like everything is dependent on wireless technology, it really isn't the case, and it sort of starts with taking those simple steps, like hardwiring using an Ethernet cable, using a corded landline phone, right? And you'll be surprised at not only how much better those seem, but also just how feasible it might seem that it didn't seem before. And taking those small steps is a great way to get started and continue that trend of making that more sustainable move. What should our priorities lie in terms of mitigating the environmental impacts of wireless technologies? Should we focus on renewable energy infrastructure, consumer behavior, or something else? Yeah, so I guess it can kind of seem like there's sort of a lot going on here, right? And where do we get started? So renewable energy, I guess I'll circle back to that. I think that it's sort of like I don't know, it's an imperfect analogy, but maybe electric cars in some sense, right? That's sort of what that would be like, right? Taking an activity that's sort of inherently unsustainable, right? Which is having massive amounts of private automobile usage and trying to make that more efficient by changing the energy source, right? Which isn't bad, but it's that can sort of be used as a justification for any environmentally harmful activity, right? And this isn't just environmentally harmful in terms of energy consumption, right? It's energy, it's the interactions with the environment, it's from a health perspective. I mean, there's many different problems with the technology. So focusing just on where the energy coming from doesn't really adequately address the issue. Infrastructure is definitely a key component in terms of making sure that this infrastructure is, the wired infrastructure is preserved and is accessible for people who need it to be accessible to them, right? making sure that it's available for everyone and an option everywhere for everyone. So that you don't have this sort of perceived justification or need for any of the wireless infrastructure. Consumer behavior is also important. That's sort of getting at the demand side of it more. Uh, but educating consumers about some of these issues and maybe just creating some awareness and maybe just starting the conversation about these different technologies. And are all of these wireless technologies really the best option for you? In a lot of cases, the answer is no, anyways. So it's a great time to maybe to reevaluate that. I wonder how the convenience of Ethernet can be increased to improve adoption, since it's not even something that I would even remotely consider at the moment. Well, I guess I would ask, why is that, right? And what aspect of it do you mean by convenience, right? Because the whole idea there is that you have a wire, right, that you were using to hardwire. So if by that you mean that it's inconvenient because it's wired, I'm not sure that that's going to change since that's kind of the idea, right? But I think this sort of gets at the broader issue, perhaps of accessibility. Maybe Ethernet is not super accessible in that everywhere where we want to work, there might not be an Ethernet port, right? So that circles back to this whole idea of making sure that this infrastructure is accessible everywhere and available where people need it. So I'm not sure if we'll be seeing Ethernet ports in say Starbucks anytime soon. But making sure that in study areas, perhaps in universities, right, anywhere where students might be bringing their laptops and using them, making sure that Ethernet ports are available there for people to hardwire their laptops. Um, or in workplaces. I guess with desktop computers, you sort of already have that infrastructure there for that anyway. But maybe in newer open workspaces, right? If maybe that's not the focus, making sure that that infrastructure is there as well, making sure that the infrastructure is there so that the users of this technology have that available. That's super important. So I think that would be the thing to focus on here is making sure that this infrastructure is there so that if you want to be able to use it, then you can using it. Reducing those barriers to being able to adopt this technology. If the powerful big tech industry is advancing 5G and other new wireless technologies, what could incentivize them to retract or slow these advances? Is it even realistic to consider a transition to wired technologies? I think this is sort of two separate, not necessarily related questions. To answer the first one, I'm not sure if there is anything that would incentivize them to retract or slow down their own technology. That's asking a lot of a corporation that owes a lot to their shareholders, right? And if we look at what these companies have been doing, they've not really paid any mind to the welfare of the consumer at all, right? I mean, especially in some of these industries, uh, basically you have big wireless, right? They don't care about the consumer. So why would they retract or slow these advances? Why would they willingly go the route of lower profit? It just doesn't make financial sense. So I don't think that anything in the way of this being a problem would incentivize them. That's sort of just a foolish expectation. It's really going to come from changing consumer preferences or different government regulations, but really being forced to change direction in a way that if they don't change direction, then maybe their business model is threatened, and that's really the only way that this is going to change on their end. Otherwise, they're just going to keep on doing it because that's what they want to do, and it's been working so far, right? So, is it realistic to consider a transition to wired technologies? Not if we're waiting for big wireless to suddenly say, hey, maybe we shouldn't be doing this. That's sort of like relying on the fossil fuel industry to say, hey, maybe you shouldn't be driving, maybe you should be taking a bike. If you're waiting for that, climate crisis is not going to be solved anytime soon, pretty much if ever. So it's not realistic to wait for them. It's really going to depend on people taking action, people mobilizing in their communities, and people really learning about some of these impacts and educating themselves and making informed decisions and educating others. That's really where it's going to start. So I think if we can get that, then it definitely is realistic to consider a transition to wired technologies, beginning at small scales and transitioning up to larger scales. Do the benefits of smart meters, such as the optimization of energy production, outweigh the cost to consumers and their added emissions? That's sort of the claim again that the utilities have been putting forward for years. It just doesn't hold up, right? There's no evidence that smart meters save consumers energy. There's no evidence that smart meters have made the grid greener, and there's no evidence that smart meters are going to be reducing emissions or optimizing really anytime soon. If we look at other parts of the smart grid, I think that's a different story. But smart meters specifically don't really provide these benefits that the utilities claim that they do. So there are other ways that we can think about optimizing and doing this. And even with smart meters, right? With smart meters, you can make them wired. You can have them communicate over a phone line or over the power lines themselves. It's power line communications. They don't need to be wireless. So they could be optimized, but the utilities aren't just going to do that suddenly because right now they don't have the financial incentive to do that. So smart meters as they're currently deployed and possibly just in general are just not going to be a solution to any of these issues. They're just going to be the problem. How can we more effectively mitigate the environmental impact of wireless communication? Are there ways to make it less harmful? Or should the focus be on carbon offset type mitigation strategies? Um, yeah, a couple of things here. Again, I think circling back to the tobacco analogy, it's like saying, are there ways to make tobacco less harmful? Yeah, don't smoke it. I mean, I'm not really sure what else there is to that. I guess maybe there's less harm, but I wouldn't call that being safer. And it's sort of the same thing here. Um, the less wireless you can have, right? That definitely reduces the harm. So I think that's a great place to start. But trying to sort of justify or continue this reliance on this unsustainable infrastructure um, is not really meaningfully addressing the problem as much as we need to right now, just given the widespread impacts. So, really shifting away to a better option to wired infrastructure is really the answer, and there's not really an adequate substitute for that. Carbon offset type mitigation strategies could be good if it's an area where maybe there isn't really an alternative right now to something. But really the problem with that is carbon offsets are often used to justify activities that we really don't need to be doing in the first place, right? And it's sort of just an after the fact trying to remedy it when really we could just avoid the problem in the first place. So I don't know that I would really consider carbon offset a solution here because carbon offsets you could just claim are the solution to any problems that we have right now, right? Anything that's energy intensive, just use carbon offsets and life will be good. And it's unfortunately not really that simple. That's not really a meaningful way to address the problem. As we progress technologically as a society, are we going to see an inverse relationship when it comes to technological advancement and energy consumption? Um, Let me think about this. Inverse relationship. I guess we've already sort of been seeing that, right? With a lot of these technologies, especially these wireless consumer technologies. Um, we've sort of been looking at decreasing capabilities and decreasing quality and just decreasing, uh, sort of going from like, I don't know if I would call it high tech to low tech, but uh, becoming less technologically, I guess the quality of it has been going down. I think that's the thing that's most clear here, and that is sort of an inverse relationship, and that a lot of the technologies that are huge consumers of energy, if you look at the whole ecosystem, and are environmentally destructive because of planned obsolescence and just being engineered to fail and not being very durable, are precisely these technologies, right? It's all connected together. So a shift towards wired options is also a shift towards more durable options, more reliable options that last longer. It's a shift away from this culture of consumerist planned obsolescence and having to replace everything every few years. And it's taking a stand against that all and really saying that we should be focusing on actual quality instruments, quality appliances, quality technology that is reliable and works well, rather than just the next big fad that will make these companies money that we should all feel obligated to be replacing, that isn't very high quality in the first place. So if that makes any sense, that's sort of the trend that's been going on for a little while, is people moving towards like, say, from a landline, which is, very high quality, it's very comfortable to use, to, say, a cell phone, which isn't very ergonomic. It's not built to communicate voice well. The call quality is terrible. Anytime that I talk to somebody who's on a cell phone, it just sounds awful. I don't know how people can put up with it these days, but it's just very poor at doing what it's supposedly there to do. And then you have all these environmental impacts because that technology is not meant to be high quality or built to last. It's just not, right? Apple doesn't make money if you buy their products once and you don't buy them again, right? That's not their goal. They want you to keep coming back, right? That's their whole business model. So and these business models are just fundamentally unsustainable. So um, I think upsetting that and trying to go back to how things were for much of the 20th century, where things just lasted for decades and were user serviceable, is going to be a huge component of that. And that's often the case with a lot of these wired options. And wired technologies is that that's just the culture that they come from, is that they're technologies that are durable and built to last because there's no reason for them not to be. It just makes sense. So, sorry if that was a little bit of rambling about that, but that's sort of where I've seen it going, and I think that's a whole culture that really needs to be reevaluated. Is that planned obsolescence is really, really destructive for the environment and the planet, and that's something we really want to move away from. Considering that significant parts of the developing world rely on wireless technology for significant parts of people's daily lives, how can we balance the benefit of wireless access with the carbon emissions associated with them? Um, yeah, I mean, this is a good point in that it brings up the fact that a lot of third world countries don't have the wired infrastructure that first world countries do. What they've done is, and I find this, I guess, a partly insulting and partly misleading term, is they call it leapfrogging, right? They leapfrog over the wired technologies like landline phones and fixed broadband internet to these wireless things that came about later. And it sort of promotes this myth that these technologies are somehow superior. They're not superior in any way. In fact, they're inferior in most regards. Um, the only two things to keep in mind are they didn't exist when the wired options first came around. So it's sort of leapfrogging in terms of time forward. And then the other thing is that in some cases it's lower cost to deploy, right? So that's why they sort of go directly to this, because this is the lowest cost option to make some of this access available. And you touch on that here when you talk about the benefit of wireless access. I don't know if it's necessarily the benefit of wireless access, right? It's just the benefit of this, of having technology and internet access, and having that digital access in the first place. But it doesn't need to be wireless. So I think in the same way that we're trying to look at wiring rural America here in the United States and making sure that everyone here has access to the same high quality wired options that most urban and suburban areas do. We need to be looking at doing the same thing around the world and making sure that third world countries have first class internet infrastructure and telecommunications infrastructure, not third world, third class, inferior infrastructure like some of these wireless options, because they can't support the kinds of activities that the wired options do. They're just poor quality. Um, it promotes more environmental destruction in terms of the environmentally unsustainable products that you're using, like cell phones, right? So I think the balance here is just making sure that that's wired as much as possible, and that might be a difficult problem to address. I'm not saying it isn't, because a lot of these areas don't have a lot of money. So how do you make this affordable and environmentally friendly? And I think a great thing to do would be if a lot of these private companies that sort of claim that, we're all about connecting everybody, even companies like Facebook and Microsoft and Google, they talk about their initiatives to connect the world. And if they really put their money where their mouth was and invested in high quality wired infrastructure in some of these countries to get them some of the same levels of access and quality of access that we have, that would be a really good thing. Whether that will happen, I'm not holding my breath, but I think that would be a good way forward. Are there any current eco-friendly wireless solutions? I, yeah, I mean, I guess to circle back, it sort of reminds me of the question like, are there any lung-friendly tobacco solutions? Aren't those what e-cigarettes are? But yeah, I guess again, I'd avoid framing it as eco-friendly, right? It's sort of an oxymoron. This technology infrastructure is not eco-friendly. In fact, it's incredibly destructive to the environment in many different ways. But there are some options that I guess I think what you're trying to get at is are there any options that are maybe less destructive than some of the mainstream options? And the one thing that does come to mind is so with cordless phones, right? I think the modern standard for that is something called DACT. I'm not precisely sure what that stands for off the top of my head. I think it's like digital enhanced cordless technology or something. I mean, you can look that up, but it's DEC 6.0 is really the standard right now with most cordless phones. So these are the cordless phones that are connected to like your home landline, right? Not cell phones. Cordless phones are mostly in the DEC 6.0 standard. And this is a change from like in the 1990s when most cordless phones were analog in the 900 megahertz range. Today, most of them are DEC 6.0, which is, I believe, in the 2.4 gigahertz range. And the way that technology operates, for the most part, is it's communicating all the time, regardless of whether or not you're using it. So if you have cordless phones, they are continuously emitting radiation even when the cordless phones are not in use. They're constantly communicating with the base station that is actually plugged into your phone line somewhere in your house. They're constantly communicating with that. And so that's incredibly unnecessary. It's a big health hazard. And that's actually a reason that some companies have come out with what they call EcoDuct, which is where the cordless phones only transmit while you're actually talking on the phone. So you're only they're really only emitting radiation when we're actually using them, which is still not good in that, it's not good to be using them at all. But if you're looking at energy consumption and I guess the environment in that ecosystem, it's not as bad as it would be if it was just regular DEC 6.0. I don't know if I would call it environmentally friendly still, but it is I guess not as bad as sort of what's mainstream with cordless phone technology today. So that's the one thing that comes to mind. I don't know if I know of anything else that I would consider anything remotely eco-friendly. I think I would consider sort of the wired options to be the eco-friendly alternative, or at least much friendlier alternative. But the EcoDuct does come to mind. How can we mobilize towards wired communication? Yeah, that's a great open-ended question, which I think I've hinted at a couple times actually. but I think it really starts with you yourself taking action, right? If you're waiting for somebody else to say, to come into your room and say, here's an Ethernet cable, let's get hardwiring, right? That's not going to happen. So um, having this individual awareness of it and then being able to act on it and being able to take steps in your lifestyle to reduce your impact and to make sure that you're using technology in ways that are more efficient or as efficient as possible. I think that's where it really starts. And from there, organizing with different communities um, to make sure that this infrastructure is available in areas like your place of work or your place of school or wherever, making sure that that is the predominant option for communications. I think that's really where it starts. It's in many ways it is sort of like this grassroots thing. So I think that is the best way to get started is for you to make your own changes, these changes in your lifestyle. That is the best way to get started. 5G becomes so inefficient on delivering data. Why are all the countries excited to promote the 5G technology? Yeah, it's sort of counterintuitive, isn't it? Right? But I mean, it's sort of like gasoline powered cars are so inefficient. Why are all these manufacturers excited about them? Because people want them. It sells, right? I mean, it sort of comes down to that. I mean, why are a lot of the messed up things in the world happening? It's because somebody somewhere is getting a paycheck and somebody somewhere is willing to pay for it. I think that's really what it comes down to. So, consumers, a lot of consumers are hyped up about this technology. A lot of them are excited about faster wireless speeds because they don't know, or maybe I guess I would say that they just don't know. Like they just have this mind view that wireless is the option, and they don't know that actually it's an even better option if you're looking for speed is some of these high-speed wired options like fiber or cable or whatever. And they just narrowly focus in on that and they want that high speed wireless, but it's really not necessary for high speed communications at all. Um, so uh, it's I think that's what it comes down to. The other thing is it's sort of viewed as this competition right now, right? There's this whole race to 5G where companies and countries are competing for the technology, right? I think that was sort of the basis for a lot of the rollbacks and local control that the FCC did in the past couple of years is they said, we need to win the race to 5G with China. So we don't care if it's bad for the environment or bad for the planet, right? This is an economic race. We want to one up China. That's basically how the government sees this as an opportunity to one up China. And, sort of an ego thing, I guess, in that way. So I guess in that sense, it's sort of like a national pride or national tech capability thing. Like, if they're going to be doing it, we better be doing it before they do. But that type of thing has consequences, right? I mean, look at the Cold War, right? Look at the buildup of nuclear weapons. This type of activity comes at a cost. And you would hope that you kind of learn from history, but that isn't always the case. So. Should we consider another technology to get instead of the 5G network? Yeah, all of these wired options are another technology. And I don't want to say it's like an alternative because 5G, again, if we go back to the beginning of this presentation, wireless is just really an auxiliary service. It's at the edge of the network. So 5G is going to require fiber deployments in massive amounts. It's not like it's fiber or 5G. It's more like fiber or fiber and 5G, right? And it's sort of like, fiber is going to be the backbone regardless, right? It's probably going to be coming somewhere near you. The question is it going to be coming all the way to your house? Or are companies going to cut corners and say, you know what, this is good enough to get it up to this substation here. Now we can put up a cell tower and everyone can have wireless access to this fiber backbone, right? Instead of actually connecting everyone directly to that. That's more of what it's like. And it's more like, just not having 5G and not having these wireless options promoted as uh, what it's sort of being portrayed as now, which is this great new technology that is going to solve a lot of problems, um, which is really just a big industry myth. So the main focus should be both investing in existing infrastructure like existing copper lines and fiber lines, as well as making sure that if fiber is deployed, it's not deployed for 5G, it's actually deployed to get people fiber directly to consumers and businesses. Fiber isn't the only option. I think it's the most talked about one. And there's some organizations that have this fiber only mentality, which I disagree with. Copper is still a valuable wired option, right? And a lot of places don't have fiber, but they have copper. They have either coaxial cable, so cable internet, or they have copper phone lines. And actually, probably they have both. The copper phone lines have been there the longest. So you can have either dial-up, which isn't broadband, of course, or you can have DSL on that copper phone line. And then if you have cable TV in your area available, then you can probably have cable internet as well over those same coaxial cables. So I don't think these should be discounted either. This is also valuable infrastructure which can get the job done. It's still a great option. It's not obsolete, and it shouldn't be completely phased out in favor of fiber, especially for voice communications. Copper landlines are important because copper conducts electricity, and being able to have your phone work in a power outage is important. And that's something that you don't have with fiber. So fiber for broadband is good, but you don't want it to displace copper either. And you don't want 5G being deployed with fiber as well. So that's sort of the caveat to this whole situation. I'd be interested in expanding more on possibilities to make wireless technology more energy efficient and a better option for connectivity. Again, this smacks of the whole like I'm interested in how to make smoking safer, a better option for smoking, but without hitting on that a bunch more. Again, I think a good example of this that I mentioned was the EcoDuct cordless phone, right? Which was specifically created to address this problem of, I guess, energy consumption. I think health was probably the primary concern, but energy consumption is also a significant factor there. That did make it a better option. So I guess if you're going to have a cordless phone at the end of the day, and you're not going to switch to a better wired phone, and you want that cordless phone, then maybe an EcoDuct is a good option for that, right? It's better than just sticking with a DACT cordless phone. So it's something. But in order to make meaningful progress, right, you can't really constrain yourself to just improvements like that to wireless technologies, because that's not really going to be enough to address a lot of these issues. In some cases, it's just not possible. And so to really have these meaningful changes, making wired options more accessible and more of an option for more people is going to be the best option. One question I have is if there seems to be a large amount of national and global concern about the carbon impacts from wireless communication, or if people are just completely focused on the need to make internet access more accessible through technologies like 5G, or if people are just not aware of the carbon impacts generally. Has there been lobbying from companies such as Verizon preventing the legislation of relevant climate policies in the industry, or has a type of policy just not been proposed? Yeah, this is a really really excellent question actually. I really like this, and I think this does sort of get to the heart of some of these things, right? A lot of these things aren't necessarily inherently about wireless, right? Like the article about deploying uh, internet access via drones in a rural area upstate so that kids can work from home or kids can learn from home, right? Um, I mean, that sounds good on the surface, right? It's about connecting people. And the end goal at the end of the day is to get people internet access. It's not, a lot of people don't really care how it's done. They just care that it gets done. And I think that's where it's really important to say, hey, we should, these goals are really good, but we should make sure that we get it done in the best way possible. And that's where you really want to focus on the mechanism and making sure that it's wired instead of wireless. So I think that is a good point there, in that a lot of these end goals aren't necessarily about wireless. They're just about getting people access, but maybe not recognizing that there are better alternatives. And I guess education there and just making people aware of that is going to be very important. Um, uh, are people not aware of the carbon impacts generally? Probably not really, right? Because most people only think of the device that they see and hold in their hands. Probably a lot of them aren't even aware of the large amounts of embodied energy that goes into their manufacturing. And the energy that they see when they plug, if you plug a mobile or a cell phone into a wall outlet, right, that is the least significant part of the energy ecosystem, right? It's less significant than the embodied energy, and it's less significant than the base stations and the wireless access networks. So most people just don't see that because that has all been externalized to them. So they're not really aware of it because it just isn't in their mind view. So has there been lobbying from companies such as Verizon? Absolutely. Specifically on climate, usually it's more about health and safety, right? The fact that a lot of these are dangerous technologies, right? Non-ionizing radiation is a carcinogen, and depending on what type of radiation, or I guess how that radiation is being uh, being emitted, that makes a difference. And some of these technologies are worse than others. The big thing with big wireless has been sort of covering up and casting doubt on a lot of the science showing health effects and harm to the environment, like plants and wildlife and all that. And trying to just say, nothing to see here. This is all safe technology. And to that end, they've even gone and funded their own studies showing no harm. And again, just continuing to cast doubt on science. It's right out of the big tobacco playbook. It's the same exact thing. So most of their lobbying goes into that. I don't really think that energy and climate has been on their radar super much because that isn't really the big thing with them. It's more about the health and environmental impacts, um, or the non-energy environmental impacts. So I'm maybe there is some of this, but that's definitely not what's dominant right now. It's more about the health and safety type stuff that more people are focused on. But this is also another thing to be concerned about. I wonder if companies are aware of the climate impact of virtual communications and if they consider this impact as part of their emission scope analysis and other sustainability reports. Yeah, and I guess I don't know. I'm sure that some companies maybe do, and probably a lot of companies don't. But I think it would be great if companies became more aware of this, um, not just specifically about wired versus wireless, but in general. Looking at ways that they can reduce their impact and make more sustainable choices with all their technology, right? Avoiding planned obsolescence, avoiding wireless as much as possible. So um, if they consider that and they looked into that, I think that would be really eye-opening for them, and it would be a good step forward. As long as they're not mandated to do it, I kind of doubt that it will catch on in any big way, but it would be a great thing to do for companies that are looking for that sustainable impact. So I think with that, we've come to the end of all of the questions that were submitted. So thank you again. I know it's been a little while now, but thank you for taking the time to watch. And I'm hopeful that as time goes on, that this will become an area of greater focus as people are looking at ways that they can really address the climate issue in serious ways, not just rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic, but actually taking meaningful actions to effect change in their communities, in their countries, and around the world. So, if there are other questions, I think this will be online shortly. So, feel free to ask and feel free to ask any questions that you have, but definitely get the conversation going in your communities and think about ways that we can start taking a look at some of these impacts and reducing them.